Hello everyone and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin as always, and today, while I have a nice little cup of blackberry tea, I'm going to give you a brief overview into the origins of opera. And I'm sure maybe I've lost some of you just now because I think the general consensus that we have around opera is that it's boring. It's some big grandiose theater event that old hoity-toity people go to see while they spill wine all over their silk dresses. We imagine some big rotund woman with long blonde braids and a Viking helmet blaring some kind of foghorn note loud enough to scare away all the birds in the city. But however you feel about opera, it's impossible to deny that it takes a lot of talent in order to be an opera singer. And it's something that really can be splendid. It's something that is a marker for sophistication and art, high art in particular. But the thing is, we've known about opera for such a long time that we kind of forget that it had to start somewhere. We just sort of think it's one of those things that have been around forever and we take it for granted. So that being said, where did opera start and how did it start? And before we go too far, if for some crazy reason you don't know what opera means or what opera is, the literal translation of the word opera from Italian means work. And the definition of the word opera means a form of theater where music is the leading role and singers are the supporting cast. And of course, when we think about it, that might just be a definition of musical theater in general. But if we think about it, in musical theater, the songs are usually delivered in the same language as an audience. And we don't focus so much on the music as much as what the cast members are saying. That's why sometimes we even have moments where just the cast members are speaking. We have no music in the background at all. But the thing is, with opera, especially if you've ever played one of these musical pieces on the piano, for instance, if you play something accompanying, say, Hamilton, you're going to have somewhat of a more simple piece to play. But if you play a song like De Viene alla Finestra from Don Giovanni, then it's going to be a little bit more intricate because they placed more emphasis on the music than they do in the average musical theater production. They don't really think of the accompanying music as being as much of a key piece or a key character as they do in opera. So when it comes to opera, you're not always going to hear an opera that's sung in the same language as the language that you speak. So one thing that really sets opera apart from, say, a musical theater production is the presence of a libretto or text that helps you go through and read what the accompanying text says so you can understand what the singer is trying to communicate through their song. And now something you need to know is that operas are composed of two different types of songs. So we have recitative, which is kind of a song that moves the story along. The people are kind of singing what they're doing and how it's going to affect them and so forth. But an aria is usually the more famous song that you'll hear if you buy like a best of record or something from an opera production. These are the songs that are more emotional and they're usually only sung by one character. So you're hearing exactly what the character in that moment is feeling, and they'll usually discuss it repeatedly. Sometimes they'll use the same phrases multiple times so they can effectively communicate what it is that they're feeling. Now, all of that aside, let's dig into the actual history of opera. So, opera actually begins much further back than you would expect. We can actually trace some origins all the way back to ancient Rome. In the midst of chariot races and gladiator battles, there were also these musical and theatrical performances, and they date back as far as the 4th century BCE, or before Common Era. And from the fall of Rome, kind of through the Middle Ages, there's not as much of a grand emphasis on theater that we would eventually see. So with Italy being the birthplace of the Renaissance and the home of all these productions centuries earlier, the former classical ideas of ancient Greece and Rome once again became the standard of excellence throughout the Italian territory. So because there's this renewed interest in art and growing invention in the field of not only visual art, but in the field of music, we have the material necessary to create very elaborate and resplendent theatrical productions unlike anything the world has ever seen before. And so with the rise of theater during the Renaissance, there were usually a lot of Roman plays depicting mythology or history that were usually performed in the courts, rather influential Italian princes and their important and wealthy guests. And the reason why we see a lot of history and mythology in opera is because these are stories that people are already somewhat familiar with. So they have this interest in it that's kind of peaked already. They can look through and see this character and be like, oh yes, that's Julius Caesar, or oh, that's Cleopatra. However, given some of the heavy subject matter, of course, throughout mythology or history, oftentimes the stories would be very sad. And if we've learned anything from the rules of storytelling, we know that you need some kind of comic relief or something to get the audience's mind off of all of this heavy subject matter. So extra expense would usually be paid to include very lavish intermezzi or intermediate pieces that could distract from the sorrows of the action. You could have elaborate dances or music entertainments with spectacular stage designs and effects, these really ornate costumes, and, think of Masquerade and Phantom of the Opera, or even the ballet scene that took place before everything kind of turned wrong with the production of Il Muto. And you kind of have an idea of what that's like. Or even think of the Thénardiers and Master of the House and Les Mis. That'll give you some sort of an idea of why these kind of breaks were necessary. So even though these productions did take place hundreds of years ago, we still have some sources that discuss just how grand and ornate these intermezzi could be. So it was once said that in a performance that took place in 1502, that a group of satyrs chased wild beasts around in time to a music clock, and Swiss soldiers danced a battle of war while a golden ball melted to reveal a quartet of singing women. And I don't know about you, but I get dizzy just hearing that description. I can't imagine what that sort of thing would look like live. So you can see how the spectacle of theater is really starting to intrigue people. And in Florence, Italy, a group of artists, musicians, writers, and patrons gathered together to form the Florentine Camerata, which dedicated themselves to telling Greek drama and tragedies through songs and music. And from there, we see one of the influential figures of opera emerge, which is Jacopo Peri, who composed Daphne in 1597. And this was, of course, based off of the story of Daphne and Apollo from Greek mythology. But sadly, this production is mostly lost, but this was sort of the hallmark for where opera would grow. And we have other stories that take root from Daphne, and they grow and other people begin to put them to song. So one of the most famous examples of this, and also considered one of the very first notable operas, is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, known as L'Orfeo. And this, however, you can actually still see in modern productions today. So you can explore some of this music here and see some of opera's humble beginnings. And because opera got its start in Italy, Italy was going to be one of the most famous centers of opera in the world. We're going to see a lot of operas that are sung in Italian. And one of the hallmarks of especially this early Baroque Italian opera is the desire to have a clear soprano voice. And given that some women were still not commonly seen in the theatrical world, as they would eventually go on to be, this beautiful high voice would sometimes be achieved by a castrati or a castrated male. And if you watch some older operas, you'll see that there are some men that can sing in this range, even though we've done away with the practice of castrati. And one example in particular is Giulio Cesare, in which Julius Caesar and Ptolemy both have that high soprano voice, or the alto castrato. And now we have a variety of different vocal parts. If you've ever sung in a choir or done musical theater, you'll be familiar with some of these already. But of course, you have your sopranos, your mezzos, your altos, your tenors, your basses, your baritones, countertenors. From there, you can see how the different voices eventually go on to tell the different parts of the story. So usually an evil villain in the story would sing in a bass voice, and the heroine and the hero would sing in this soprano voice, or now the hero usually sings in a tenor vocal range. And the thing is, even after opera kind of begins to grow and gain some popularity throughout Italy, it would still take a while for opera to be shown outside of a court setting. So if you weren't in the ranks with Italian royalty or Italian aristocracy, then you wouldn't really really get access to this sort of entertainment. But about 40 years or so after the birth of opera, the idea of opera being shown to the public originated in something of a marketing scheme, actually. So they decided they would take it to the public, but in order to ensure ticket sales and popularity, they created a season for opera in Venice, Italy, meaning that the shows would only take place during a certain time of year. And with these limitations, ticket sales soared because everybody wanted in on this exclusive, soon-to-be-gone thing. And I mean, I can see why. Like, if you told me, I don't know, that Ice Age 12 is in theaters, I wouldn't care. But if you told me that it was only going to be available for a week in theaters, okay, I honestly still wouldn't really care that much, but I would be more interested than I was before. Going back to L'Orfeo, as we talked about earlier, the composer Claudio Monteverdi composed some of these operas in Venice, and one of his followers, Francis Cavalli, helped to spread opera around Italy during this new emerging Baroque period. And the thing is, when we think of Baroque, we think of stuff that's really over the top and ornate. So when you think about opera being very ornate in its choreography and dancing and music, Baroque and opera are just going to fit together like a hand in a glove. Like, it's just perfect and meant to be. So people in Italy are gradually taking to this idea of opera. And as the spread took place, an Italian poet by the name of Pietro Metastasio helped to popularize the use of a libretto in opera. And as we discussed earlier, the libretto is basically your pamphlet with summaries and translations. And this would eventually help solidify a different genre of opera known as opera seria, which, as you can tell, is the more serious version in comparison to the comedic operas that were the other most popular genre of opera. So when we think about it, why would librettos be so important? Well, the educated and wealthy court members might be able to understand opera in different languages, but, you know, say you're from the merchant class who became wealthy through work and didn't have a courtly education. If you were a merchant from France who had traveled to Italy and went to go see an opera, if you didn't speak Italian and you were sitting there just listening to it, you wouldn't really be able to derive that much meaning from it. But luckily, there was still this international draw to opera before the libretto, and this was because the music and the singing was meant to evoke feeling, but combining the libretto and opera together created an even bigger appeal because you could still get that feeling from singing and from the orchestra, but you could also know just what they were saying, and you could gain a better understanding of it and most likely a better enjoyment of it as well. So this increases their audience even more. Now that opera has been cemented in Italy, the next question is, where does it go? So some of the most famous Italian operas of the Baroque era were written by a German who spent most of his life in London, George Friedrich Handel, who is a pretty well-known composer. We mostly know him for the Alleluia chorus. He created a spread of opera throughout England with his very cosmopolitan sphere, and Christopher Willibald Gluck in Germany wanted to emphasize opera by creating music and lyrics that reflected each other. So throughout the Germanic area, he is able to create and spread opera in those regions. And Jean-Baptiste Louis, who spent most of his life working as the chief musician of Louis XIV of France, was originally from Italy, but he had this very strong determination that he was going to create operas in his own style and characterize them with more of a French identity and not necessarily too attached to its opera roots. So we can see from the determination and background of these different composers that not only is opera spreading, but now opera is sort of starting to develop its own identities in different places. And as I mentioned earlier, Baroque and opera, that was just a match made in heaven. The stories were usually about these larger-than-life historical figures and legends or gods and goddesses, and there were these fantastical storylines. But as the Classica era of music begins to take place, we begin to see stories that are somewhat more realistic. And one of the greatest examples you can see for this is, of course, Mozart. So when Mozart steps onto the scene, we see stories like The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni that involve some real-life figures, and we get invested in stories that could very well happen in the day-to-day lives of Mozart's audience. And of course, I have to say that with a bit of a grain of salt, because Mozart does have the Magic Flute opera, and Don Giovanni does invite a statue to come to dinner, and the statue makes well on his promise, comes to dinner just before hell opens up and swallows Don Giovanni whole. But, the point's there. So not only are composers like Mozart starting to create stories that will resonate more with the audience, but they're also starting to develop this interesting blend because, as we know, Mozart was born in Vienna, but he was also influenced by the German composer Gluck, and his spread of opera, it's a testimony to opera's developing popularity. Mozart had success in his music as well as his operas, and his works were being performed all throughout Europe, from London to Prague, and by the time Mozart dies, he's created these legendary works. But the thing is that by the time Mozart is dead, his opera seria niche is starting to fall out of style. The classical opera has become something of an obsolete genre. And from there, we have the birth of the Romantic period of music. And there's this big influence in creating art that's more aesthetically beautiful as opposed to mathematically structural. We see in Romantic art this emphasis on nature and the metaphysical world, and we see a lot of very beautifully done work that tries to dig into what's lovely in the world. And particularly when you hear music from the classical period versus the Romantic period, you can pick up this difference when you listen. And when it comes to classical music, you can almost kind of predict where it'll go next based on what makes sense with the rhythm. You'll be able to get along with it pretty quickly. But with Romantic music, it's meant to be more emotionally driven and derive its movement from the ups and downs of human feelings. So it's not always likely that it'll go where you expect it to go. And I'll show you guys an example of this. So first, for our classical music example, So the first example we have here, this is an example of classical music, and it's from Handel's opera Giulio Cesare, and it's called Va tacito e nascosto. And then next we have a clip from the song Notre Toast by Georges Bizet's very famous opera Carmen. Okay, so it might be a little bit easier said than done to kind of pick up the differences, but once you sort of start to familiarize yourself with the music, you can definitely start to hear the difference between the genres. Now, back to opera's history. So with the growth of Romanticism, we start to see more of an emphasis placed on the singer and a lot of embellishments and ornamentation. So we're going to hear more trills and vibrato and very showy riffs, and the accompanying music is meant to act as a harmony, and we actually just listened to a sample of this, but one of the greatest examples, the pinnacle of Romantic opera, is in fact Georges Bizet's Carmen, probably one of the most famous operas of all time. It tells the story of a gypsy woman named Carmen and a soldier who becomes obsessed with her and ultimately kills her in the end out of jealousy. And as dark as this is, these darker endings are something of a hallmark of the Romantic period, and we see these tragic endings pop up a lot in other operas during this time, including Otello, which is Verdi's recreation of Shakespeare's Othello. We see it in Rigoletto, La Traviata, etc., etc. But meanwhile, in Germany, one of the biggest figures of opera, Richard Wagner, was beginning to create opera in a larger-than-life setting, kind of like its roots. So we think of his operas that retell Norse mythology, like Das Rheingold. And when we think of opera in general, and of the Viking lady with the braids, this is due to the image that Wagner was able to garner. He created this concept of opera known as Gesamtkunstwerk, or a complete work of art. And not only do these operas have very extravagant music and acting and singing, but the poetry of the lyrics are written to evoke a lot of beauty within the libretto, and the sets are ornate and painted to look above and beyond reality, so the audience is leaving the real world for a while. This is one of opera's most famous centuries. I think a lot of people, basically when someone's going to say what their favorite opera is, it's probably going to be an opera from the Romantic period if it's not a Mozart opera. And that's a testament to how much those operas really kind of resonate with us. Like, I know for me, Carmen's one of my favorite operas. It's something that emotionally draws me in and I get excited to listen to it. And it's something that I could listen to again and again and not really get tired of. And as we begin to approach the 20th century, we see something of a decline in opera, especially in the latter half of the century. But we still have some very talented composers like Strauss and Debussy, Puccini, and Schoenberg. And Schoenberg in particular would prove to be especially important with his use of 12-tone technique, which, if you listen to it, it creates these very beautiful melodic passages. But ultimately, we're starting to see more musicals being composed from the 1930s onward. And we start to see more of a growth of Broadway shows that a little bit more story-based rather than music-based. And to this day, we can see that that's still kind of the case. I think you'll find a lot more people that say they're interested in Broadway shows and musicals rather than someone who's interested in opera. And in fact, the Metropolitan Opera in the United States has suggested that, or the average age of one of their audience members is about 60. So that's part of the reason why we imagine opera to be this, hoity-toity thing that older people listen to, because it's not really something that appeals to the youth as much as it used to. So we might still be able to see some change in history of opera, whether it grows or eventually dies off. But even if you don't like opera, we can still appreciate the growth of opera and how it's influenced music over time. We can see how it gathered different characteristics in different countries and how it took music and theater from being for the lucky and rich few to something that the world could eventually enjoy. And I know for me, that's something I'm very grateful for. So that's it for today. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'm sorry again about the delay. I got a bit sick earlier this week, and we have relatives that are coming to visit us soon, so we've been in a bit of an uproar trying to make sure everything is in tip-top shape. But I appreciate you all so much for the positive feedback and for the growth that we're starting to see. I'm really happy that people are enjoying these discussions and conversations. And as I've mentioned before, if there's a topic that you'd like to hear that you're interested in, I would be so happy to hear recommendations. I love being able to do research and learn about things that I didn't previously know. And if you liked this episode or if you liked the podcast, feel free to give this episode a like, follow the podcast, subscribe to it. I don't know, all the platforms are different. So one thing I've asked in the past is if you enjoyed it to leave a review. And I know that this can be difficult because that's usually something that's only limited to people that use Apple Podcasts. But I am using a website now that will make rating and reviewing the podcast a lot easier. So if you go to ratethispodcast.com/teatimethoughts, you can find a way to leave a review or feedback for me, and I would welcome you to do so. I'm very happy to hear what you guys have to say. And don't forget to tune in next week when I discuss the Merry Monarch King Charles II of England with a special guest of mine. Thank you again for listening. This is Tea Time Thoughts. I'll talk to you next week.